Thank you very much, Gurley. And thank you, friends, for inviting me. Some of you have known me for a long time, and the wheelchair doesn't really mean I'm almost dead. I just have a bad knee, and it's easier to ride than to walk on it sometimes. So if I return to it, it's only because I'm tired of standing on that knee. When my wife was introduced, these days you need to add one other thing, and that is to recognize her as one of the most patient people in the world. She has put up with me for 68 years this summer. About 20 years ago, I was being introduced by a good friend of mine, and he was making reference to the fact that we had been married for over 40 years. And he added, "To the same woman?" Anyway, yes, sitting next to her is one of our 10 grandchildren, Jade McNeil. Right. But let me get on with this. I think Eva asked me to talk about 15 minutes. I've pretty much written out what I want to say, in part because I tend to digress a lot and am likely to go over time. But the other problem, I must admit, is that by the time you reach your 10th decade, memory begins to slip. And I had some things I wanted to say, but I didn't want to forget them. So bear with me while I read from some notes, most of which are in the abstracts pack that is a part of your folder. One of the things that's not there is just a little story. I have a student back in New York. She's quite a mature woman now. She's one of the few women and two women of color who have actually run for President of the United States. Her name is Lenora Falani. Lenora runs a school that's called the LUNCHEON School, and they do a lot of things. They do a lot of things at the LUNCHEON School, but one of the very interesting things they do is a little experiment they're running, having randomly selected kids pretend that they're gifted. They begin the year, and the task for that year is to pretend that they're gifted kids. These are primarily Latino, and black kids. And Lenora reports that the experimental kids, in comparison with her controls, are doing about a 0.5 gain in GPAs over her regular students. She isn't able to explain whether the pretense enhances their engagement or whether pretending that you are smart kind of makes you smarter. I am kind of leaning toward the second of her explanations because of my experience over the past 3 years. The Education Testing Service asked me to head something that was called the Gordon Commission on the Future of Assessment. And I'm not a scholar of assessment, but I have pretended for 3 years that I know something about your field. And I think I do. So Lenora can add to her research program me as a subject, because I think pretense does work. I suspect it works in part, though, because if you're going to pretend, you do have to engage. You do have to give attention to it. You do have to work at it. And one of the things that you're talking about at this conference is the use of gaming for educative purposes. And I don't know why it has taken us so long to get there. Although I recall maybe 30, 40 years ago, we were doing it with paper and pencil, creating, we call it programmed instruction, where each question kind of led you to the next, or it engaged you in ways that you stuck with the task even though it might otherwise be boring. So I suppose, as radical as some of the ideas you've heard at this conference are, behind them, the pedagogical notions are not really that new. In my notes, what I had planned to do and will do today is to talk to you, I hope briefly, about some of the things I learned, some of the things I've come to believe, as a result of the 3 years that I've spent pretending that I'm the leader of a group of people who are thinking about the future of assessment. I was fearful for a moment that there was a group of people behind this post who couldn't see me, but I think most of you can. Among those beliefs, the first, we talked a lot in the commission about the purposes of assessment. And you're certainly familiar with the traditional ones: accountability, admissions, guidance, placement, and probably some others. But the one that the commission focused on was assessment. Maybe the primary purpose of assessment may be to inform and improve teaching and learning, the processes and the outcomes of teaching and learning. The commission didn't last long enough. We should have had a third year to really sit around the table and debate these issues. We didn't last long enough to come to consensus around a lot of issues, but this one we did come to consensus. It was the consensus of the commission that as important as are all of the other purposes of assessment, informing and improving teaching and learning probably ought to be the most important. And in the future, we probably will have trouble justifying our positions in education if we can't do that. The domain that we call the measurement sciences kind of came into existence at a time when there was some utility in prediction. There was some utility in selecting the best of us to move on to the next opportunity. But it looks like the next period in the history of education is going to be one in which we're going to be confronted, not with selecting those who are most likely to succeed or those who have appropriately developed abilities, but how do we build capacity in a very diverse but global population. And if education can't do that, something else will come along to try to do it. Because increasingly, the peoples of the world, and they are quite diverse, are demanding to be involved, to be included. And it's very clear, as you look into the future, that to be a participant in world affairs and local affairs, to be a good citizen, I don't think we'll be employing people at useful work much longer. We're going to have to find some other ways to occupy human beings. But it does appear that being able to use one's mind, being able to think, to solve problems, to even solve problems that don't exist, to deal with abstractions, that's going to be a universally required competence. And those of us who sit around measuring to see who's got those competencies will really be kind of passé. The people who are going to be rewarded in assessment, analysis, etc., are the people who can do something about producing talent. The second thought: diversified, differentiated, distributed, embedded systems of assessment are going to be required. We have made our fortunes, and the assessment industry, as you know, is not poverty-stricken. We've made an awful lot of money with drop-in standardized tests. They are efficient, they're quick. They've told us what we thought we needed to know, say, 50, 75 years ago. They no longer tell us what we need to know. Our standardized test data give teachers very, very, very little guidance with respect to what they do about the people who have not developed the abilities. Increasingly, the society is going to expect of us, even though it's preoccupied at the moment with concerns for accountability, the society is going to require that if kids spend the amount of time we now ask them to spend being assessed, and we as citizens spend the kind of money we currently pay to do assessments, we've got to be more than the assessment of history. We've got to be influencing the future. One of the consultants to the chair of the Gordon Commission is a chap named Kenneth Gergen. Ken's a professor of psychology, social psychologist. And not many people in the room old enough to have been reading that literature back in the 50s and 60s. But I think it was in 59 or 61, somewhere but in that period, that Ken wrote a very influential essay, Psychology as History. And what he was writing about then was that we students of behavior were studying expressed behavior. And by the time behavior is expressed, it's history. Ken thought that we ought to be trying to find ways to analyze, to assess, to document the here and now, what's happening now, and to shape what happens next. The intervention, the assessment intervention ought to be shaping what's emerging as behavior, not looking back, to see what the behavior has been. To do that, we will need very diversified, very differentiated assessment probes that are embedded in the processes of teaching and learning, with the kind of immediate feedback to the people not only who are teaching, but the people who are learning. And it's very interesting to me as I read about and hear about some of the advances in gaming. I think you've got the capacity to do that. I think we can generate information about human performance, even the learning performances of persons, that can provide immediate feedback to them and their teachers, which can shape Gergen's concern with that emergent behavior, the next behavior, not looking back to see why I didn't pass that chemistry course or why I got this particular item wrong. That's important. I'm not even sure if what we currently do under the influence of accountability that our data can even tell us why we got it wrong. It can tell us that we got it wrong, or how many of us got it wrong, or which things we knew or didn't know. That beautiful piece of work that my co-chairperson and the late Bob Glazer did on knowing what students know. I would call that a kind of pillar of our profession. But it's for last century. It's not for the 21st century. As important as it is to know what students know, we need to also know, and even better, understand what it is they're learning, and why they are not learning it, and how I shape the next learning experience to make learning more possible, building capacity, not simply measuring it. Now, given the persistent and recalcitrant presence of disparities in test scores for learners from different social divisions into which we place subjects, it may be worth consideration that the measurement science, or measurement sciences, give equal attention to the development of abilities. One of the papers written for the Gordon Commission that came in late, so we haven't had a chance to circulate it as yet, is a piece on formative assessment that Bob Calfee wrote for us. That's in the direction, that's in the spirit of what my colleagues and I were talking about on the Gordon Commission. The kind of analysis of processes, the analysis of behaviors, the analysis of situations that supply information, data that are useful to the learner in reinforcing things that are working well and correcting things that are not working so well, that are understandable to teachers and ways that teachers can use those data to decide what to do next. When I was much younger than I am now, it was, the mid-50s. A woman who earned her living in Germany as a teacher. She was not Jewish, but she anticipated the Hitlerian Holocaust and left that country and came to this country. We employed her at the clinic where I was then the chief psychologist. Her name was Elsa Heusemann. Elsa, in Germany, worked with children who were the victims of cerebral damage, neurologically impaired kids. And as a teacher of those kids, she couldn't get from us psychologists what she needed, so she began trying to develop a test, she called it, that would inform intervention more effectively. Her book, if I remember correctly, is something like the evaluation of educability and cerebrally, the evaluation of educational processes in children with neurological damage. And what Elsa was trying to do, even though she insisted that she wanted to standardize it, she went to her death believing that she had failed because she was not able to standardize the tests. I remember talking to her about a month before she died, trying to convince her that I thought she had succeeded in what she should have intended to do, even though she missed the boat on what she intended to do. For what she was trying to do, standardization wasn't the problem. You want to back away from standardization so that you can understand what your subject is doing or capable of doing. Elsa asked the question, under what conditions can a child sort colors? Under what conditions can a child solve a particular kind of problem? What kinds of contextual supports are necessary if this child is going to move from this point to the next point? Her work was relatively ignored by our field, largely because it was very time-consuming. Also spent a week or more on one child, and then spent another week trying to write up a report that was intelligible to teachers who had to use that information to work with the child. Under our pressure of accountability and other, I guess they're socially useful, but they're not pedagogically rational. demands, such as accountability, we have to do it so quickly and in such large numbers and aggregate over such large populations that what ELSA was about is just not possible. But if one takes seriously what is happening in the epistemologies that inform pedagogy, if one takes seriously what's happening in the changing paradigms we have for pedagogy, the task of the future is going to be the task that Elsa sought to achieve with her neurologically impaired subjects, trying to understand what is necessary in order for them to learn, assuming, of course, that most of them can learn. I think maybe a third of you in the room are old enough to remember the work of J. Oh, that's right, I don't have to use that thing. The work of J. McVie Hunt in his. Can I move? Oh, that's right, I'm sorry. You see what complications you people who work in the technologies make for us human beings. I was about to refer to the work of J. McVie Hunt. The book, I think, was Intelligence and Experience. And in that, another piece of technology. You know who I am, right? So you don't need that. J. McVie posed the possibility that intelligence was relatively unlimited, and it could be developed because it was a product of experience. But the task for the educator was to find the appropriate match between the characteristics and needs of the learner and the characteristics and needs of the learning situation. What are the pedagogical interventions? What are the pedagogical conditions under which learners could learn? That's a big task for us in measurement, and I think given the excellence with which we have gone about measuring developed ability, if we applied that same energy and talent to trying to understand what's necessary to develop ability, and to develop ability differentially for different people whose characteristics and life experiences are quite different, I think we could prove to be up to the task, particularly those of us in measurement who are so arrogant as to think that measurement science is pretty much the top of the field in psychology. The rest of us weren't able to come as close to matching the scientific model of the natural sciences as we in measurement like to think that we are. But if you consider the epistemologies that are being thought about for 2050 make positivist traditions in psychology, and particularly in measurement. I want to say dysfunctional, but less functional than we have thought them to be. Our science came out. My wife's been cheerleading for me for, I told you, 68 years. Yeah. And she still distracts me. Oh, I was talking about the shifting. I was talking about well, I have to stop since I'm distracted. I began my career as a Presbyterian preacher And I was sent to Omaha, Nebraska as a field missionary. The task was to build a church for black people in Omaha, Nebraska in those days. And you know, it still was true. Black people and white people don't worship together in many places, and one would think that at least in the church we could get over those prejudices. But the Presbyterian Church recognized that there was a black community in Omaha, and they were trying to recruit believers, so they sent me out there to build this church. The Quakers sent Susan, Susan Gitt, out there to work on race relations, peace, and labor relations. And they asked some of us ministers to guide that group of students who were spending their summer trying to preach peace and improve race relations. And of course, I was one of the mentors, guides for the group, and I spotted this one and guided her into my arms. Anyway, when she was up to her usual things, I was reminded of those years together. And I've forgotten now why I was talking about that. Was I talking about J. Beckley Hunt and his notion that our central task is to match learner characteristics, learning situations, and learning opportunities to amplify the potential that he saw in all human beings. Jay didn't think we were going to get rid of individual differences among people, but he did think that we could raise the level of IQ, of developability, to possibly 200 or 300% of what it is now if we could solve that problem of the match. And I think the point I had reached when I was distracted is that a task for measurement science is to try to test the hypothesis that is implicit in McPhee-Hunt's book. That is it possible to so understand human behavior and the indicators of human potential and the needs of learning situations to so document, so identify these, that we can put them together in ways that greatly amplify our human abilities. Why don't I stop for a second and collect my thoughts, because I've gotten away from my notes, and I'll try to wrap this up. I was asked if you could interrupt me. You may, since I'm probably taking more of your time than Eva had anticipated. Oh yes, my fourth kind of belief or thought after this experience in the last 3 years. The unusual success of the measurement sciences at addressing the status and developed abilities of persons may be precluding attention to the analysis and documentation of the processes by which these abilities are developed. I'll not read that and simply tell you what I'm talking about. I think we've become so good at measuring developed ability that we have, by and large, ignored the opportunity to analyze the processes by which those abilities develop. My commission was moving toward the conclusion that we shouldn't give up that talent that we had developed at assessing the status of developed ability. But to justify our keep in the future, we will need to develop the capacity to analyze, to document, to appraise, I would say primarily to understand those processes by which those developed abilities are developing. Something sounds a little bit redundant, I think. I was making the point a few minutes ago that if we are as good as we are as students of human behavior, that task is not beyond us. Measurement science can be used to engage that task. And we are challenged in this period. We are challenged not only by the demand, but by the emerging capacity. Oh, it was, I guess, in the 60s that John Flanagan and Bob Glazer and a few others of us were enamored with personalization, with individualized instruction. We backed away from it for two reasons. One of them, Dick Snow and Lee Cronbach did that monumental analysis of the existing research on trait-treatment interactions and wrote a rather discouraging report. Although toward the last chapter of that, I think it was Dick who insisted that he and Lee include the admonition that even though they didn't have the evidence for the appropriateness, the effectiveness, the potential of the paradigm, it was still so logically persuasive that they didn't want to give it up. But that was one of the negative reports that they gave on the potential for that kind of research. Led many of us to kind of back away from that model. I wrote a little essay suggesting that the research available at that time looked for interactions between single traits and single interventions. We weren't capable then of looking at multiple traits, multiple characteristics, dynamic characteristics, and multiple interventions and dynamic interventions. But the combination of the absence of empirical evidence for the model and the difficulty in managing the data that came out of the efforts at implementing the model when we looked at multiple traits and multiple interactions pretty much closed down that research. But as you look at the kind of stuff you're doing now, the kind of technologies that are currently available to us, the things that stumped Flanagan and Glazer and a few other people, if those had been available to those minds at that time, I think we would be much, much further ahead on individualization and personalization. Now, if you put the problem I mentioned earlier, the challenge of how we educate lots and lots of people who vary in very different ways and who have very varied opportunities to learn. It sounds like their notion of personalizing, individualizing the designs for education for persons sounds like a logical direction to go. Now, when you marry that with the kind of stuff you're doing and capable of doing and the technologies that are emerging for us, I think it's a very, very bright future there. I'll kind of wrap this up. This is an exciting time for measurement science, I think. We've got changing paradigms for pedagogy. We've got radically different conditions we are aware of radically different conditions under which education can and does occur. One of my books, 10, it was in the 90s, I called it Supplementary Education. I was talking about the possibility that the education that occurs outside of classrooms may be more important than the education that occurs inside of classrooms. And I wrote that before I was aware of the tremendous the increasing popularity and availability of electronic games, the stuff that you do. We've got shifting epistemologies. They're changing our notions of what it means to know, of what it means to understand. In my commission's report, there's a beautiful essay by Carl Burreiter and Magdalena, I won't even try to pronounce her second name, but what they're writing, what I asked them to write about was what will it mean to be an educated person in the middle of the 21st century? And one of the notions that they advance that come to mind at the moment is the difference between knowledge and knowledgeability. They are suggesting that knowledge is not going to lose its importance, but it may lose its central position and have to share it with knowledgeability, knowing about the knowledge and knowledges that are out there. I'm not sure now whether it's in their paper or one of the papers that has been generated for this meeting, but it's the problem of the form in which knowledge will be presented to us in a period of digital technologies. It's going to be bits and bits and bits and bits of knowledge. And the intellective task is going to be to put those bits together in different ways, in different situations to solve different kinds of problems. So it won't be enough simply to have a lot of knowledge anymore. You're going to have to be able to develop relationships between the bodies of knowledge and even those little bits of knowledge that the computer is capable of giving to us. And if that were not enough, my friend Gergen called my attention to something he calls relational adjudication. You've got to not only recognize, we will not only have to recognize the relationships between these bits of knowledge, but how do you understand it? How do you make sense out of it when they are paradoxical, when they are contradictory? The capacity to adjudicate paradox, to adjudicate contradictory relationships between things. Now, in my commission, we were talking about the implications of that kind of thinking for thinking about what assessment is going to be. I'm hoping that those of us who are still working on the theoretical side will give attention to that problem. But those of you who are working on the applications of that in the epistemic gaming domain, it would seem to me you not only have the problem, but you may be on the edge of the technologies that could be used to tackle problems like that. I'm getting tired, so I'll quit. I do want to say how fortunate you younger people are to live and be working at this time when the measurement science can add to its excellent capacity for the assessment of education, a parallel capacity directed at assessment for education. One of the essays written for my commission, education in the service of assessment in the service of education, not just assessment of education. Thank you and good luck to you.